Much, Philippa, and I just want to say how important I think this debate is, because the question could not be more urgent. As we've been hearing from all of the contributions this afternoon, every warning light on the dashboard is flashing red. And so my brief remarks, I just wanted to set out 3 tests of what I think the UK's climate leadership needs to look like in the coming months. And it requires government to act with the speed and the scale that the science demands, turning targets on a page into real action delivered on the ground. And one bit of good news might just be that the terrible experience of living through COVID has demonstrated that when they choose, when there is a common understanding about the urgency of the threat, ministers can act fast. They can do things that we would never have expected. They wrote off £13 billion of NHS debt almost overnight. They housed the homeless. They supported millions who couldn't work. And for a while at least, however imperfectly, they put health and well-being above short-term profit and growth. They found the so-called magic money tree. Now that's the kind of ambition and urgency that we need to tackle the nature and climate emergencies. And what's different is that now it has shown to be possible. So for those 3 tests, the first is about climate coherence, by which I mean all policies have to be aligned around the same objective, creating a world in which everyone can thrive within the means of our one life-giving planet. It means not allowing progress in one area, getting coal off the electricity grid, for example, to be completely undermined by policies in another, like the famous new coal mine in 30 years in Cumbria, for example, or the pursuit of a £27 billion road building scheme, or the inexplicable scrapping of the Green Homes grant, or the refusal to rule out issuing new North Sea oil and gas licenses, or the setting up of a new infrastructure bank. That's definitely good, but refusing to rule out lending projects to projects driving fossil fuel extraction. That is very definitely bad. And that list goes on. These are not the actions of a government committed to climate leadership. Climate coherence also means recognizing that climate and nature are 2 sides of the same coin. And so the strategy for COP26 has to be aligned with and informed by the strategy for COP15, the Biodiversity Summit in Kunming in October. But more than anything else, climate coherence has to mean recognizing that we cannot continue with an economic system based on ever-increasing growth if we are to protect and to restore our climate and the natural world. A new UN climate science report recently warned, and I quote, that economic stimulus focused primarily on growth would jeopardize the Paris Agreement. Well, that's putting it pretty mildly. And the government, as presidents of both G7 and COP26, should be leading the world in redesigning the economy to put the well-being of people and planet first. Now, my second test, climate realism. And by that I mean that we need to commit to action that is commensurate with the scale of the emergency that we face. As others have said, net zero by 2050 is simply nowhere near ambitious enough. Greta Thunberg famously says, act as if your house is on fire, because it is. Well, when your house is on fire, you don't dial 999 and ask for the fire engines to come in 30 years' time. You want them now. And we also need to face the truth that even if all of the ambitions that we have for COP26 were met, it still wouldn't be enough. And Alicia has already pointed to the so-called emissions gap between what we need and what's being committed. And when we're looking at the UK's efforts, they're talking a good talk, but they're not delivering yet. Yes, we had that announcement last week that they would accept the Climate Change Committee's advice on the 6th carbon budget, the 78% reduction emissions by 2035. But as it stands, the UK is not on track to achieve either the 4th or the 5th carbon budgets, which are based on much weaker commitments of an 80% reduction by 2050. And it doesn't include the fact that 46% of the UK's total carbon footprint comes from imported emissions to feed our domestic consumption. And it's worth bearing in mind too that the government's much trumpeted 10-point plan launched last autumn takes us only about halfway towards the inadequate emission cuts that we have from the government's own targets. So we need to tell the truth about our climate emissions, and rich nations in particular need to do the maths. The IPCC has estimated that a global carbon budget, the total burnable carbon between 2018 and 2100, consistent with a 66% chance of staying below 1.5 degrees warming, is just 420 billion tons of CO2. That is currently being burned at approximately 40 billion tons per year. On current trends, that gives us just 10 years until 2030 at the latest, before that global carbon budget is used up. And after that point, we would have to rely on costly and uncertain negative emission technologies to avoid global heating of more than 1.5 degrees. So that is the reality. That is the inconvenient truth that we have to face. And my final test is to ensure that climate justice is at the heart of the COP26 process. This is a crisis overwhelmingly created by the wealthiest in society. Almost 50% of global emissions are produced by the richest 10% of the world's population. But the impact of those emissions are hurting the poorest first and worst. Justice demands that the voices of the climate vulnerable countries and communities are heard loud and clear at COP26, not left out on the sidelines. Justice demands that addressing loss and damage is a priority, that new and additional climate finance is provided over and above the $100 billion committed in Paris, but still not fulfilled. And justice also demands that the concerns of young people are met. Young people have been at the forefront of fighting for change, and it is their futures at stake. We owe it to them to ensure that their voices are heard at COP26, and more fundamentally, that the well-being of future generations is at the heart of policy development. That's why I introduced a bill into the House of Commons last year, which would require public bodies to consider the well-being of future generations. Because as we come out of this awful pandemic, there has to be a change in thinking. There can be no return to normal, because normal was nowhere near good enough. There could be no longer prioritizing short-term economic goals above the health of people and planet.